philosophy of quantum biology, and I'm going to mostly talk about a particular case study, but I want to start with what is quantum biology, and in particular with the question of how relevant quantum physics is for biology. So, in a more or less obvious way, quantum physics and electrodynamics shape all molecules and determine molecular recognition, the workings of proteins, DNA, and so on, van der Waals forces, discrete molecular orbitals, and more generally, the stability of matter. So, insofar as all that is quantum physics, then that is a natural basis for life, for understanding life and everything we see. But, so like I said, this seems to be obviously right, but it's completely unsurprising and it's not specific to biology. So it's just like saying that quantum physics is incredibly relevant for explaining why the table is so stable and doesn't just fall apart instantly. So if there's anything that's particularly interesting about quantum biology, it cannot just be about the stability of matter. It has to be something to do with how quantum physics is more directly relevant to specific biological processes. So the focus of quantum biology is not on the role of quantum mechanics in things like molecular structure and the stability of matter, but in exploring how quantum effects can be relevant and how quantum physics can be explanatory for certain processes that are important for living things. But a question that I think motivates some skepticism about quantum biology is, so aren't biological systems really too big and wet and really not the sort of system where you would expect to find quantum effects, or you would expect for them to be important? Well, yes, they are generally big and wet, but there are at least a few examples of quantum effects in biology. So one of them is the explanation for the efficiency of light transfer in photosynthesis depends on excited state dynamics and charge separation, where quantum superposition and coherence dynamics play important roles. So there's evidence for what people at least consider to be long-lived quantum coherence playing an important role in energy transfer processes, at least in bacterial chlorophyll, and we could hypothesize that the same might be the case in plants. And here long-lived, by long-lived people mean spatially and temporally extended coherence covering several nanometers and time spans as long as a few hundred femtoseconds. So apparently that counts as long-lived. So the wave-like characteristic of the energy transfer within the photosynthetic complex partly explains its extreme efficiency. So it's a lot more efficient than we would expect. And so it allows the photosynthetic complexes to sample vast areas of phase space to find the most efficient path. So it's not that the process wouldn't happen without the quantum effect, but it explains how efficient it is, how much more efficient it is. At least that's the idea. Another commonly discussed example in quantum biology is magnetic orientation in migratory birds. So there are a lot of animals that can detect the Earth's magnetic field. Some mammals can distinguish between north and south. Most birds usually distinguish the direction of the equator versus the direction of the pole, regardless of whether it's north or south. And the current leading hypothesis for how they do this is based on the radical pair mechanism, which is, so birds have this protein in their retina, which is a cryptochrome, and when it's impacted by light, it forms a radical pair, which then somehow indicates to the bird the direction of the magnetic field. However, as far as I'm aware, a classical mechanism has not been completely ruled out. So it's not 100% certain that that's the mechanism. So I think we should be a little bit careful with this example. And another widely discussed case is mutations in DNA. So John Joe McFadden, for example, highlights the role of proton tunneling in DNA mutations. And that seems like a reasonable thing to think does happen. However, I don't really think that this is a very special phenomenon, because lots of things can lead to mutations in DNA. So either the enzyme that is doing the replication can make mistakes, or the proofreading process that takes place can also fail. Radiation damage can lead to mutation. Chemical mutagens can lead to mutation. Gamma rays from outer space can lead to mutation. All sorts of things can lead to mutation. And natural selection doesn't really care which one. So it doesn't seem to me that it's part of the explanatory. It might explain why some mutations happen, but it really doesn't make much difference whether it's that process that causes mutations or some other process. So I don't particularly find this example illuminating. So many scientists do accept that quantum mechanics must be involved in biology, but they think that this is mostly a trivial role. So it's mainly to do with just the stability of matter. It's mainly to do with the tiny things of which biological systems are composed. But then it's only relevant for things that happen at those tiny scales, and it's not going to be super relevant for larger processes or things like evolutionary outcomes. Well, I don't think that's quite right. So what I'm going to discuss here is a case where a quantum effect features in an absolutely crucial biological process. Namely, it features in respiration and photosynthesis, and which are the main ways that organisms on Earth acquire free energy for their activities. So it's literally what is keeping us alive right now. And as it happens, the fact that living things on Earth rely on this quantum process for their metabolism turns out to have really far-reaching evolutionary consequences, which I think is quite interesting. So, very short primer on bioenergetics. So all life requires some mechanism to obtain free energy from the environment, usually by exploiting some pre-existing thermodynamic disequilibrium. And what all Earth organisms do is use chemiosmosis to drive ATP synthesis. So ATP is the energy currency of the cell, and is produced by this little molecular machine, the ATP synthase. So what happens in respiration is basically this. We extract electrons from food, and they are passed along a chain of carriers all the way to oxygen, which is the ultimate electron acceptor. And then the energy in each of these transfers is used by the cell to pump protons across a membrane. And then the protons are only allowed to flow back across the membrane, which is impermeable to protons, through the ATP synthase. And when they do that, the ATP synthase physically rotates and produces ATP out of its precursors. So it's a bit like a hydroelectric dam. So this is the crucial way in which all organisms on Earth acquire energy, and it involves electron transfer. And in fact, Charles Cackel hypothesizes that due to their ubiquitous availability and how convenient they are to use, the use of free energy from electrons might actually be a universal feature of life. You might expect to find that on life on other planets as well. So it occurs in both respiration and photosynthesis, the only difference being that in respiration the energy comes ultimately from food, and in photosynthesis it comes ultimately from sunlight. Right, so now where does the quantum bit come into this? Well, so respiration, and again photosynthesis, it operates similarly, involves the transfer of electrons across a chain of redox centers. So this is the mapping that has been obtained for the redox centers in respiratory complex 1. There are 4 of them. And electrons, as you know, are quantum particles that jump through this process of quantum tunneling from one redox center to the next. The redox centers, by the way, are made of iron-sulfur clusters that have high affinity for the electrons. And so, since they tunnel from one redox center to the next, the distance between these redox centers is going to be absolutely crucial for that process to happen. And that's because electron tunneling only takes place at distances less than 14 angstroms. And in fact, an increase in 1 angstrom in the distance between adjacent redox centers will decrease the rate of electron transfer tenfold. So it will, and it will very quickly become unsustainable and basically drop to 0. So this means that the respiratory complexes have to be shaped just right in order for the complexes to be just, in order for the redox centers to be at the right distance from each other. So, and there is some evidence that, in fact, organisms are under natural selection to maintain these short distances, which are always have to be smaller than 14 angstroms and are in many cases less than 7. So there's natural selection at the molecular level that works on the design of these proteins, mainly to assure that these distances are small enough. Okay. So what? Yeah, go ahead.
So, but it's just the mechanism just forces them to be smaller. There's no. It's not a medium distance. They can be as small as possible.
Well, they can be as small as possible, but they still have to go. So this is within the membrane. They still have to go across the membrane. So they can't be too small that they'll fall out of the membrane. Yeah. Yes.
Another quick question. I always thought, well, I was taught anyway, that quantum tunneling, its presence in photosynthesis was controversial. There were some scientists that argued that the evidence didn't indicate that there was nothing besides just classical particle behavior at work. So I'm wondering whether that's no longer a valid counter-argument. Is it confirmed?
So I am actually not discussing photosynthesis, even though the process of even though this process is similar, but here it's specifically in the respiratory complexes, and I think, as far as I know, it's very well established.
Okay, but for photosynthesis, not so much.
Photosynthesis, I'm not entirely sure.
Okay.
Right, so I suppose it is, but I'm actually not completely sure.
Margarida, would you like to leave questions at the end, or do you welcome questions?
I don't mind if
Okay.
people have questions. Yeah, that's okay. Okay, so what's going to be the problem with all this? Well, this has to do with an interesting feature of the evolutionary history of life on Earth. So all complex life on Earth is eukaryotic. So eukaryotes include the animals and the plants and the fungi and some unicellular things. And they originated from an endosymbiotic partnership between an ancient archaeon and an ancient bacterium. So the archaeon basically ate the bacterium, but then instead of digesting it, it just let it live there. And it formed a symbiosis with it. And it turns out that the evolution of many complex traits was kickstarted by this endosymbiosis. Now mitochondria, so that guy then evolved into what are currently our mitochondria, which are the things in our cells that actually do the respiration. So mitochondria are no longer separate organisms. They're organelles that provide the energy for our cells. But, interestingly, they still have their own DNA. Now, most mitochondrial genes, about more than 90% of them, have been transferred to the nucleus over the course of evolution, but not all of them. Now, it makes sense for the mitochondrial genes to be transferred to the nucleus for various reasons. So first of all, it would be a lot more efficient to have just one transcription and translation machinery. You would need to have that in mitochondria as well. It allows more control to the nucleus, so to the cell. And also having DNA located right next to the respiratory membranes is not the best idea in terms of mutations, because it's near radicals of oxygen, so not great.
And the mitochondria are next to the respiratory membrane.
The respiratory membrane is the mitochondrial membrane, right? And yet, all eukaryotes that have oxygen respiration have mitochondrial DNA. So, what's the explanation for that? Well, it's that they have to be there. If they didn't have to be there, they would have been transferred to the nucleus, because there are good reasons for that to happen. But some genes are needed in the mitochondria to control respiration in real time. So the mitochondria need to very quickly respond to changes in electron flux, in oxygen availability, in the ratio between ATP and ADP, and so on. And it's a lot easier to do that if the genes and their products are right there, rather than having to go all the way to the nucleus. So this is known as the core hypothesis, co-location for redox regulation. So the idea is that this co-location facilitates rapid and direct regulatory coupling, and there is no need for what John Allen calls prior consultation and coordination with what may be regarded as the nucleocytoplasmic bureaucracy. So the mitochondria can detect if something is wrong and correct it right there and then. That's a lot more efficient, but it means that they must retain some genes and the translation machinery for those. So the DNA molecules need to be physically located in the mitochondria for that to happen. That's cool, okay. However, the result of this is that some respiratory complex subunits are coded by the genes that stayed in the mitochondria, and some are coded by the genes that are now in the nucleus. So here is a depiction of the mitochondrial respiratory chain with the various respiratory complexes and the ATP synthase. And the subunits in green are coded by genes in the nucleus, and the subunits in red are coded by genes in the mitochondria. Doesn't seem like the ideal arrangement. So as you can imagine, there needs to be a very delicate balance between the nuclear and the mitochondrial genomes in order to maintain respiration proceeding smoothly. Because these things, remember that these things have to be at the right distances from each other. And so, any mismatch between the mitochondrial and the nuclear genome is likely to lead to a slowing down of electron transfer or a complete breakdown of respiration. And the reason is precisely because of the mechanism of electron transfer. So, because as soon as the distance between redox centers increases only a tiny little bit, electron transfer slows down by an order of magnitude, and so the efficiency of respiration drops exponentially. And there's good evidence that this is exactly what is happening. So, what does this mean for evolution, and in particular for the evolution of complex life? Well, it means that the need for co-adaptation between the mitochondrial and the nuclear genomes is going to drive several important features of eukaryotic evolution, so of the evolution of all complex life on Earth. In particular, sexual reproduction, the maintenance of two sexes or mating types, uniparental inheritance of mitochondria, and possibly mate choice and even perhaps the existence of species. So, to start with, eukaryotes, so complex cells that derive from this endosymbiosis, coincide with the organisms that have sexual reproduction. Bacteria do perfectly well without it. So the main thing, the crucial thing about sexual reproduction is not specifically gene exchange. Bacteria can also exchange genes. It's mainly recombination. So, as you know, you inherit two chromosomes, one from each parent, right? But if there was no recombination, you would just inherit one chromosome in bulk. So either the one that your parent got from their mother or their father, right? And so you would inherit two entire chromosomes that just had genes all from one grandfather and from one grandmother. That's not what happens. So what happens is that when chromosomes align, they do recombination, so they exchange bits and pieces. And what this does is it separates genes that would otherwise be linked. And this is a good thing because it means that genes will face selection individually rather than in bulk. And this is particularly good for eukaryotes because mitochondrial DNA has no recombination and it tends to mutate faster. And somehow nuclear genes need to keep up with that. And they keep up with that by compensating, by evolving on their own to compensate for the negative effects of mitochondrial mutations. So sexual reproduction with recombination is precisely, is at least one of the reasons, is at least one of the mechanisms by which the nuclear genome can keep up with mutational erosion of the mitochondria. But there can be sexual reproduction without having separate mating types. So why have two sexes? And this is a thing that biologists have pondered for a very long time because it doesn't seem very advantageous. And especially because it significantly increases the cost of mate searching. Now this may not seem like a very big problem for big animals like us, but this evolved, if you think of tiny cells in the ocean, it's a really big problem. But having two sexes that is the only way, or allows for uniparental transmission of mitochondria. So one of the sexes specializes in transmitting just genes, and the other one specializes in transmitting a bunch of other things as well, including in particular the mitochondria, and in plants the chloroplasts as well. And why is that a good thing? Well, because it prevents heteroplasmy. So it prevents the existence of mitochondria from different lineages within the same individual. And that would be a bad thing, because then if there was any mutation that increased their replication rate, it would be favored, even at a cost to the individual. So the ideal situation is to have as little variation in mitochondria within the individual organism, and then to have as much variation as possible between different individuals. And that's exactly what we find in this reproductive system. Mate choice is also a crucial thing in reproduction. And in particular, choosing a mate of your own species is incredibly important. So it's probably the main component of mate choice in a lot of species. And that's because mating outside of species boundaries has a significant cost in terms of mitonuclear incompatibility. Now, again, this doesn't maybe strike us as being super important, because our species is really an outlier here, because our species is incredibly isolated. All our closely related species are extinct. So for humans, there's never any issue. But for a lot of other animals, there is. Most other animal species have closely related species, and it would be very easy to get it wrong, and then the offspring would suffer the effects of having low compatibility between the nuclear and mitochondrial genes. So ornamentation, such as, for example, the color and the different songs of birds, is one of the things that facilitates the choice of conspecific mates. And there's evidence that clustering birds by ornamentation and clustering them by mitochondrial genotypes gives almost the same results. So that's some evidence that one is an indicator for the other. And there's also some evidence that species-typical ornaments in birds are genetically linked to mitochondrial genes that have been transferred to the nucleus, which are precisely the ones that you need to be compatible with the mitochondrial ones. And although this is more speculative, there's some indication that even within the same species, ornamental traits that are condition dependent, such that fitter organisms will have more of those or better of those, also correlate with better respiratory function. And again, this is in birds. Why is all this evidence in birds? It's mostly because flying birds in particular need to be in absolutely top respiratory condition, because flying is incredibly energy costly. So birds really can't afford to have respiration that works so-so. It has to be really excellent. Okay. And due to these features of mate choice, this might also partly explain the existence of, or the maintenance of species boundaries. Okay, so what does all of this tell us about the relationship between physics and biology, if anything? And more broadly about scale and scientific explanation. So on the one hand, we can just see the fact that there are some quantum physical effects that are relevant for some biological processes as just exemplifying how physical and biological aspects are intertwined in the explanation of biological processes. And that is not surprising, that just reflects the physical nature of living systems. So that's sort of what you would expect. But philosophers of biology have often argued that for an entity as complex, and I would add and as big as a cell, the fact that quarks have certain spins is irrelevant. Okay, maybe. So I admit that maybe most of the time, quantum processes are actually not very relevant for biological processes, for biological explanations. There are a lot of biological explanations that we can give without knowing any quantum physics. In fact, there are a lot of good biological explanations one can give without knowing anything about genes and molecules either. Case in point, Darwin. However, and that's because most biological processes take place at scales that are far above the quantum scale. So physical laws that are prevalent at higher scales are likely to be more relevant for explaining things like water transport in trees and the movement of birds in self-powered flight and so on. And yeah. But importantly, we shouldn't presume to know a priori which scales are going to turn out to be most relevant for the explanation of a particular phenomenon. And in some cases, it's going to turn out to be quite surprising what scales are actually relevant for the explanation. So there's this assumption in philosophy of biology that all explanations in biology bottom out at the molecular level. That's the ground level of biological explanation. But in fact, there are lots of explanations in biology above and below the molecular scale. All the way to quantum physics, all the way down to quantum physics, all the way up to ecosystems or even the biosphere. And since cells obtain energy from bioenergetic processes that involve electron transfer, that essentially, indispensably involve the phenomenon of quantum tunneling, they cannot afford to miss out on these quantum processes that allow this energy transfer to obtain. So cells just have to make use of them. And since maintaining the conditions for quantum tunneling and respiration requires co-adaptation between the nucleus and the mitochondria, the fact that cells rely on this quantum process ends up having extremely far-reaching evolutionary consequences. Yeah, that's it.